Say the time. 7:02. And this meeting is called to order.
I'll start with the roll call. Member Fasoon?
Here.
Member Hodges?
Here.
Member Larson?
Here.
Member Lieberman?
Here.
Member Melgen?
Here.
Chair Vahil McClanahan.
Here. Now we're going to read the land acknowledgement. It's very loud. The City of Albany recognizes that we occupy the land originally protected by the Confederated Villages of Lishan. We acknowledge the genocide that took place on these lands and must make strides to repay the moral debt owed to this indigenous people, specifically the Ohlone tribe. We thank them for their contributions, which have transformed our community and will continue to bring forth growth and unity. The City of Albany commits to sustaining ongoing relationships with the tribe and together build a better future for all that now make this their home. Can you turn it down a little bit? It's louder than usual.
I do not have the power to turn it down, but in the back, if you can hear us, if it's possible to lower the volume a bit. We'll see.
All right, so now we're going to move to the approval of the minutes from February 21st. Do we put them up? Or we just assume
No, we
everyone's
don't
read
need to
them?
put them up.
Okay.
You just call for questions or public comment.
Okay. So, does committee have any questions on the minutes from the last meeting? All right, then we'll open it to public comment on the minutes.
We don't have any public comment for now.
Super, okay. Then, now we're on to item 3, which is general public comment.
Not quite yet. We have to.
Oh, we have to approve them.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I need a checklist. Thank you.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
Member Fasoon?
Yes.
Member Hodges?
Yes.
Member Larson?
Yes.
Member Lieberman? Yeah, you can vote yes if you'd like, or you can abstain. Either is fine. Great. And Member Melgen?
Yes.
And Chair Vahil McClanahan.
Yes. All right, now we're actually on item 3, which is general public comment for any item not on the agenda.
We do have a public comment. You may begin when you're ready.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being able to speak to the Climate Action Committee tonight. I'm glad you guys are back after a month hiatus. Plenty of work to do. So I just wanted to mention that on Monday at the City Council meeting, I attended online and recommended that they put forward a tree protection ordinance for landmark native trees on private property. I think we've had a couple incidents where a very large, almost 100-year-old oak was lost and someone had started to cut down another one, but ACAC was able to take action and meet with the owner and get him to just prune it and leave it around with some financial assistance from the community to help him with some problems he's been having, fence repair and other things. So there are quite a lot of very important trees in Albany that need to be protected, but they're not all street trees. So this goes hand in glove with this street tree master plan. So I think the City Council will be addressing that, and I think the Climate Action Committee may want to recommend also to the City Council that they do that. What was interesting was in the same meeting, I noticed on the consent calendar there was a request to authorize the purchase of a $41,000 meter monitor cart to, I guess, replace the current one, which when I saw it puttering around seemed to be doing fine. But anyway, maybe they want another And I pulled that off the consent calendar and asked, gee, they make an electric model, is this going to be electric? And was told by the mayor, Mayor Mickey, that staff had actually advised because of, and I quote, substantial mechanical issues, unquote, that the electric was deemed not suitable, and so we're getting a gas-powered vehicle. I have a hard time believing that for a golf cart type vehicle like this, where for decades electric versions have been around, that there's substantial mechanical issues, especially now with electric vehicles being so common, and with electric cars far superior on mechanical issues to internal combustion engine, that Albany was unable to find an electric vehicle. I'm really disappointed with staff not following through. This again shows the lack of urgency. This was a good time to get something out there, any electric vehicle, not waiting 10 years. And it was lost, or I guess it's lost. I would really encourage staff to look at this again, and at least Albany can have that little cart be electric if none of the other vehicles in the city are electric. So we've got to get something started. This again shows lack of urgency. Thank you very much.
Going to move on to our next public comment.
Yes, thank you. Lucinda Young here. I would echo the previous speaker's concerns. And I also, first of all, would like, I know the committee approved a climate emergency declaration a couple of months ago, and I am wondering if there has been any indication as to when that would be heard by City Council. And this recent purchase the city approved for the parking violation vehicle, I am also extremely disappointed in our city. And I think it's an indication again of the need for this climate emergency declaration. And one of the provisions of that declaration is that all city decisions should be made with regard to the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. And I have to really question whether staff, in making this decision to expend $41,000 of city funds on yet another gas vehicle, I have a really tough time understanding that the cap was given due consideration in that decision. Other cities have electric parking violation vehicles, and there's more than one model. Maybe they looked at one model that determined there were some mechanical deficits, but there's more than one model. And there's always going to be some balancing. I have to ask myself, how much weight, if any, was given to the cap in coming up with this decision? And it also, I think, reflects, there's been some discussion, or public request that some person in the city, a centralized, someone should be in a position to look at the decisions citywide around climate. There should be a central position. And I think this illustrates the need for that. I don't think that the Climate Action Committee or the Sustainability Department was consulted in coming up with this decision to purchase another gas vehicle. And I think this would have been such a good opportunity to send a message to the citizens of Albany that the city is serious about its climate action plan. We're trying to motivate citizens to move from gas to electric. The city's got to take the lead. And so this is disappointing. And lastly, I would just echo the call for a tree preservation ordinance modeled after Palo Alto or San Francisco. Thank you.
That is all for public comment for now. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to item 4, announcements.
Yeah, I have a few announcements for the committee. I'll start off with an update on some of the items that the committee passed that the public commenters referenced. We had some delays with getting them scheduled for council, but we are hoping to bring the discussion of the gas line prioritization that the CAC weighed in on a few meetings ago, the climate emergency declaration, and the fleet proposals. We're hoping to bring those all on May 6th. Of course, can't promise anything until it's actually on the agenda, since I don't get to set those, but that is our goal. So that's one announcement. Another announcement is that we have a slew of exciting events coming up in the city, many of them that are related to sustainability. On April 27th, we have our Community Expo, which hosts a wide range of community organizations, city staff, just a whole host of fun events. It takes place at the community center. Community development department will be there, as well as some other sustainability organizations. So that'll be a great time. We also have the citywide garage sale coming up on May 4th. That's a garage sale that takes place throughout the city at various people's homes, and we'll have a map to all of the garage sales taking place. If you'd like to register to host a garage sale, the registration deadline is this Friday, so don't delay. Make sure to register and pay your $10 fee to get on the map by Friday. All of the information about that can be found at albanyca.org/garage sale. And then finally, we also have the compost giveaway coming up on May 11th, the next week. This is, in addition to the compost hub, it's a separate event, and this is bagged compost from Waste Management that'll be loaded directly into cars. It takes place, I think starts at 8 or 9 a.m. That's at albanyca.org/compost. You can get the information there. So lots of great events coming up for an excellent spring.
Thank you. Do we take questions on announcements? Okay.
Yes, we do.
Any questions?
I mean, this is not important, that important, but the, so is that compost giveaway contribute to the city's, I know you said earlier that every city has a certain amount of compost or something that they need to deploy in their city. Does that contribute to the Albany's deployment?
Yes. Yeah, so the law you're referring to is SB 1383, and all cities have what's called a procurement requirement, where we're required to purchase and then do something with a certain amount of compost every year. So both our compost hub and our compost giveaway contribute to that. Any other questions?
All right, let's move to any public comment on the announcements.
It appears we don't have any public comment for now.
Any discussion of the announcements? Okay, let's move on to the fun stuff, the presentation about our KPIs.
Just give me a moment. Okay, so just as a little bit of background, we have our Climate Action and Adaptation Plan that was passed at the end of 2019, and that plan includes a range of key performance indicators. These are basically metrics to measure how well we're accomplishing the various goals that we have throughout the plan. And every year we do essentially an analysis of our key performance indicators to track how we're doing on the plan and see what's happened over the past year and how we're tracking over time. So this presentation is a summary of that. There's some more detailed KPI indicators in the spreadsheet that was attached to this memo. And then there's also some data in their presentation that isn't technically in the KPIs, but it's still interesting, so we talk about it anyways. So just to start it off, sorry about that. So our total emissions for, it should say 2022 there, I apologize. Our total emissions for 2022 was 49,100 metric tons of CO2. So that is for the 2022 number. We don't have the totals for 2023 yet, since it takes a little bit of time to get all the data in. And that equates to about 2.27 tons per capita. As you can see, the vast majority, in fact, over 50% of those emissions come from transportation, largely vehicles. And then another large chunk of that comes from natural gas usage, both in residential and non-residential buildings. And then a little bit comes from off-road emissions. That's things like, construction and garden appliances, all the other kinds of emissions you can imagine. There's a little bit that comes from waste and a very, very minimal amount that comes from electricity. Compared with last year, most of these sources of emissions have dropped slightly, with the exception of transportation, which rose slightly, about 4%. Our totals from last year went down a little bit. This chart here shows our CAP goals versus our performance so far. So Climate Action Adaptation Plan set some goals to reduce our emissions from 2004 levels to 75% by 2020, and then down to 0 by 2045. So the orange line here shows how we've been doing in comparison with those goals. As you can see, we've been on a pretty solid downward trajectory. 2020 was obviously an anomalous year, as you can imagine, but in the 2 years since then, we've sort of resumed our previous trend, which is good news. We are ahead of our targets right now. One thing I will note is that, as you can see, the line gets a little steeper starting in 2020, and right now we are not quite on track. If you just extend that trend line forward, it wouldn't quite match our goals. So we will need to increase our emissions reductions a bit going forward. That said, we're in a pretty good spot right now, all told. This chart shows emissions by source. The orange bar is transportation, which, as we said, makes up the largest chunk of emissions. As you can see, that's dropped pretty significantly over time, but it did tick up last year, as you can see. Also, of course, 2020 really does mess up all of the charts a little bit, so it makes it a little difficult to read. But one thing that's just kind of interesting to look at, sort of in the grand scheme of things, is you'll notice that the sort of pink and purple sections towards the top, that's electricity. And you can see that it shrinks over time, and really between 2017 and 2019, it goes to almost 0. And that's the shift to EBCE, now AVA, community energy, where we're getting a lot cleaner electricity. Now our default is renewable 100, which is all renewable electricity. So we've seen the emissions really, really drop from electricity over time. And that's been really significant. We've also seen pretty consistent decreases in natural gas emissions and usage over the past few years as well. So this chart is kind of a different look at emissions, a little bit different from all the charts I've been showing you previously. The previous ones are what we call a community-based inventory, which is really an accounting of all of the natural gas that comes out of our tailpipes and from our homes, the things that we consume here in Albany. However, we know that that's not the entire story, and that's why it's important to consider the consumption-based emissions inventory. This is an inventory based on all of the things that we consume in the city. So, for instance, the shirts that we're wearing today required, lots of carbon to be created, for the cotton to be grown, for the dyes, for the production, for the transportation. All of that gets calculated and put into this consumption-based inventory. And especially in an area like Albany, where we don't have a lot of production, but we do have a lot of consumption, this is a really different picture. The most recent inventory we have is from 2015, which estimated that Albany was responsible for about 300,000 metric tons of CO2, which is 6 times as much as our regular inventory shows. The reason that we aren't tracking this year over year is that it's very, very difficult to calculate, probably impossible. These are all estimates that were done by a group at UC Berkeley based on some metrics. We have a lot of things related to income and, some sales tax data and that sort of thing. But it's difficult to really see a trend line. So the main thing here is just to keep in mind that there's a whole world of emissions that we aren't tracking year to year that's important to be thinking about as we do look closely at our community-based emissions. So now I'm gonna move away from that and dig a little bit deeper into those emissions numbers and really into those major 2 chunks of natural gas and transportation. Start with natural gas here. Natural gas and electricity. This is overall building, sorry. So on the left, we have residential electricity use. As we know, the emissions from electricity has dropped to practically 0, but of course we are still using electricity. We saw a spike in 2020, probably just due to people being at home a lot more. But since that, we've seen it resume the previous trend, which was sort of a slight downward trajectory. We don't know exactly why that is. I think part of it's probably due to people installing new appliances that are more energy efficient. Of course, it could also be weather patterns or a whole variety of other things as well. And then on the right, we have our residential natural gas. As you can see, there was sort of an increase between 2015 and 2019, and then a decrease between 2019 and 2022. Pretty significant, actually. There was a 4% drop in 2022. So that's all really excellent data. It does look, based on our preliminary numbers, like there was a small increase this past year in 2023, but we don't have all the data yet, so we're not entirely sure on that. But, we'll keep an outlook. This one, again, we've seen a lot of shifts towards electrification the past few years, but it's still at the point where we're probably not going to be able to see that in a significant way in the overall citywide data. So it seems like generally the gas usage has something to do with more efficient appliances, electrification, but a lot to do with things like weather patterns. I'll also just note, you'll see that both of these are residential. We do not have access to non-residential building data, unfortunately. That is really just due to our small size. There are some data privacy rules that are statewide related to small groups, and so we're not able to get access to that data. We do some calculations and estimates to get our overall emissions numbers, but it is just an estimate, unfortunately. Back to the subject of electrification, though, we do have really good data about electrification projects in our homes, and we've seen a really significant increase, especially in heat pump HVAC systems in the past few years. Back in 2020, heat pump HVACs were, really pretty rare, sort of unheard of, not even 10% of our permits. And last year in 2023, heat pumps made up 60% of our HVAC permits. So really a significant increase just in the past couple of years. It's been really, really impressive to see. We've also seen a jump in heat pump water heater installations. That was up to 39% last year. So it's starting to become the norm. Obviously, the actual number of heat pumps in the city is relatively small still on the scheme of things, but this rate of growth has been really promising. We've also seen lots of other promising metrics. Solar in particular, we've seen almost 3,000 kilowatts of solar installed in the city since 2017. That number keeps rising every year. We had 7 all-electric units built in 2023. Obviously not a lot of new units in Albany every year, but 7 of them were all electric, which is great. And we also had 33 EV chargers permitted last year, and 28 in 2022. So lots of good things on that front. And then we have transportation. This one is a little bit of a mixed bag in some ways. So I'll start with our VMT. This is short for vehicle miles traveled. It's basically a calculation of all of the miles in a passenger vehicle or a truck or anything like that that people are driving to and from Albany throughout the year. You'll notice that this chart has 2 different colors on it. That's because we had a change in methodology in 2018. We switched from data from the Metropolitan Transportation Commission over to data from Google, which we think is a bit more accurate. Also, MTC stopped publishing their data, so here we are. But we think it's pretty good. Again, you'll notice that major drop in 2020 as people stayed home, not surprising. In 2021, it seemed like we were sort of resuming our past trend, going downwards, but in 2022, we did see an uptick in VMT, which is unfortunate. It's not entirely clear why that happened. One piece of it probably does have to do with population growth. So as you can see in the chart on the right, that's our VMT per person per day. So in 2022, the average miles traveled per person in Albany was 9. That's pretty much even with 2021. So, not a lot of change, which means that some of that growth in VMT has to do with just more people coming to the city and driving around. Of course, we had been on this downward trajectory that has stopped, even in the VMT per person per day, so what's going on with that? And part of it probably has to do with reduced usage of public transit since the pandemic. So as you can see here, this chart on the left, the BART ridership, that's a percentage of the February 2020 level. So in April, BART ridership dropped 95%. I mean, almost down to 0, just a really, really small amount of ridership. And since then, it has been growing, but it just peaked at 50% of the pre-pandemic levels, and since then has dropped again. It's unclear, if that rise is going to continue, if it's starting to level out. So we've just really seen some not very impressive public transit ridership numbers. Similar story with AC transit. So the top part of the chart right here is pre-pandemic, 2019. And then again, we see a major drop. It lost about 2/3, 60% or so during the pandemic. Started to rise again in 22 a bit, and then sort of leveling out in 2023. So that's all to say that we've really taken a hit with public transit, and that probably has something to do with the increase in VMT. One thing I will note, just going back to this slide, we have seen a drop in emissions per mile over time, which has helped. So even as we have a bit of an increase in VMT, there's also a reduction in the emissions per mile traveled. And so the emissions doesn't climb quite as quickly there. And now I'll hand it over to Sutton.
Yeah. On the brighter side of transportation, the data that we've been finding on electric vehicles has been very impressive. As you can see, Albany ranks in the middle of the curve between Alameda and the state in terms of the percent of purchases, and then in terms of percent of vehicle population, Albany actually leads both the county and the state. And then those little dotted figures are some staff predictions and calculations based on previous data. So we're seeing some very impressive statistics. There was also an increase in total EV sales, sales share, and then the population share percentage. Zooming out here, the end goal obviously is reducing the number of vehicles on the road, and then while we're doing that, we're trying to convert as many as possible to electric, and it seems we're doing a good job at that. Another thing worth recognizing that this data is kind of depicting to us is the growing affordability. The market of EVs is definitely rising, and it's becoming an option for a lot more residents. Charger availability is something that we've really love to look into. While private charging has definitely increased, public charging isn't as available in Albany, so it'll be interesting to see whether that has been playing a role. And then various state and regional EV incentive programs have definitely supported this transition. But yeah, you can go to the next slide. Looking at waste, we see some similar trends. The most impressive that we've been seeing is the reduction in landfill, which is huge. Obviously, landfill has been translating directly to our carbon emissions. Albany residents this year recorded a record low of 1.12 pounds of waste per person, which is very, very impressive, and it speaks to the individual effort in playing their part. There wasn't much budge between the compost and recycling numbers, but the landfill tonnages have shown a consistent decrease of at least 3% each year since 2019. So that's also very impressive. The diversion rate is another statistic that we're paying close attention to, and it's been hovering around 51%. While it hasn't been dropping too much, the fact that it isn't going anywhere is also very promising, but we'll keep an eye on that as well. The one other thing I'll mention, the steady organics numbers is very good. There was a slight decrease in recycling. This could be due to the need for more outreach or education revolved around it, but staff also wants to note it could be that there's just less products being put into the waste stream that are recyclable and more sustainable or more reusables being used by residents. So there's different ways to look at it, and then we'll move on. Looking at municipal and city data, we're limited in some factors in that VMT data is not something that we have too much access to. We do have access to our building data, and you could see the same dip that Michelle was talking about with our switch to EBC in 2021 has been probably the largest, or one of the larger emissions reductions. And then landfill and recycling numbers have shown similar numbers. The municipal organics, however, recorded a record high 23% of our waste stream, which is very impressive and something we're proud of. So these are some of the numbers from the staff city side of things. Yeah. This gives us an overview of some completed CAP actions, some that are in progress, just to paint a picture of what all this work is being applied to and what guidelines we've been following. So obviously transportation, we've noted, is one of the larger issues that we're trying to reduce emissions in. Developing the active transportation plan, something that staff is working towards, is one of the top priorities. It's something that's going to be hopefully addressing those emissions statistics. Creating an EV action plan, hopefully that increases areas for public charging, makes private charging easier, introduces new local incentives for adopting EVs. Yeah, just a couple other important goals that we're working on. The sustainable foodware development, we're pushing to get that policy passed so that we can reduce single-use disposables and bring that landfill total down even more. And then again, the urban forestry plan is obviously something that you all have heard about as well, hopefully increasing the canopy, and all of those co-benefits for the city. Outside of Albany, we were looking at a couple regional, state, and federal policy implications that have been playing a role. Regionally, the BACMID ruling out of sale gas appliances has obviously played a massive impact. We know the transition away from gas appliances to electric is huge. We've seen it at the local level, and I think this is something that everyone can get behind at the moment. From the state side of things, there has been some policy impacting light-duty vehicles and the percentage of EVs that have to make up those sales. So that's something we're also paying attention to and how it affects our local trends. SB 54, which I'll actually get into a little bit later this evening, touches upon plastic pollution as well as producer responsibility. And this is a statewide measure that is currently in a working draft phase, but it should play a heavy role in the next 5 years in really reducing plastic usage and single-use items all around the state. And then federally, just having the funds to support these systems from the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act has been huge for us. So, yeah. Lastly, these are just a couple of takeaways we had from a zoomed-out perspective. We saw positive trends from the pre-COVID era seem to be resuming and going back into effect. Other things that we paid attention to are the transportation and building emissions continue to be the larger percentages. So those are things that we're trying to address through the cap goals that we were looking at. The VMT data is definitely one that we're trying to address, thinking about ways to encourage active transport or shared transport or public transport, digging back into those BART ridership data to see how we can make it easier for people to get from place A to B without driving in a car by themselves. Promoting data on EV adoption and landfill reduction was also very, very promising. Yeah, and then city policies and programs have also made a huge impact. We've gotten great feedback from the community that they're liking these ideas and that they're having an impact. And going through our cap goals, honestly preparing for this meeting, there's so many that have already been tackled or are in the process of being tackled by the Sustainability Department, by the Transportation Department. So that's also another promising sign. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions on the committee?
I'm wondering if you looked at any data that compares Albany's performance to other cities' averages. I feel like Albany is, walkable and, people do their share of work to make it, low driving and lots of biking and walking. I'm wondering if that impression I have bears out in the results.
That's a good question. We did some comparisons countywide for, things like EV adoption rates. I did a couple of small comparisons to electricity and gas usage data, but it's a little bit difficult to compare apples and oranges in some ways. The transportation data is something that we could actually look at, because I know that Google has published data for some other cities. I don't know how much of it is public at the moment, but we could take a look at that and see what we find out. But I haven't done any of that yet.
You mentioned earlier about the 7 all electric units. Could you talk a little bit, can you remind me where those are and what kind of there's a ringing, what the story behind those new electric units are?
Yeah, so the vast majority of our new units every year are ADUs. That's, like an in-law unit. So I think almost all of those. I think we did have one new single-family home in the city that was electric, but I think most of them were ADUs.
I have a whole stack of questions. I'm not going to ask them all at once,
for it.
because maybe other people will have questions. Going back to the slide on citywide emissions, that previous one with the pie chart, that one, that's the emissions that take place within our borders,
That's right.
which you shared is approximately 1/6 of the consumption emissions, is that right?
Right.
I
Yes.
think, okay, all right, thank you. And then on the consumption-based emissions, there's also a transportation figure. Is that specifically transportation in which Albany residents are thought to participate when they're not in Albany?
Great question. Yeah. So the vehicle fuel direct, which is I know this, it's a little weird with the colors. You can't see everything that well. The vehicle fuel direct is effectively a VMT emissions calculation. So yeah, some of our community-based emissions are actually embedded into the consumption-based emissions. They're not completely separate charts.
But that 6 times figure still abides even so, like if we were to take out our,
So our community-based emissions are 50,000, and the consumption-based is 300,000. If you were to make them totally separate in one way or another, then it wouldn't be exactly the same calculation. Yeah, I'd say the 300,000 is more of a holistic number, so it includes some of the direct emissions, although it doesn't quite calculate everything that we do in the community-based emissions, so.
thank you. The VMT data that you get from Google, I know on the Google Maps thing, they're also tracking cyclists and pedestrians. Can we buy data about that stuff too?
They did give us some data about bicycle and pedestrian usage. I looked at it a little bit. To be honest, it's not that helpful right now because we actually have fewer years of data but we don't have as many years of data for that as we do for the vehicle miles traveled. So it's sort of just like hanging in the middle of nowhere right now. It's really more useful once you get a trend line because, of course, we know that any of these figures are going to be sort of accurate. We don't know if they're really that real, but it's really about the trend. So I think in a few years' time, once we've had some data to look at, then those numbers will be more helpful.
Awesome, thank you.
I have a follow-up question about that. Do you know if Google is tracking only if you're actively using Google Maps?
I think it can depend. I think there's some personal settings related to that. However, I think in a lot of cases, they're tracking data even when you're not using the app itself.
Okay.
I know that they've got all kinds of complicated software math things that they use to estimate overall travel, which I won't pretend to understand.
Okay.
But yeah, I think it's kind of a mix.
Okay. I was just thinking about my own use case where when I bike to work, I don't use Google Maps because I take the same route and there's no traffic consideration. But if I drive, I do because I want to know if there's traffic. So it would count me as a driver only to work.
No, I'm
You
pretty
know what
sure
I'm
it goes
saying?
on the location sharing is what they're using rather than,
And they're just pacing my ride? Do you know what I'm saying?
I think they are, yeah.
Okay.
They
Yeah, I
infer,
believe-
they are said to infer from your
From
rates. So if
my
you drove real
rate.
slow, you'd be counted as a bike.
Oh, there's an incentive to drive slow. No. All right, thank you.
Do any of the transportation emissions include air travel?
So only in the consumption-based
Oh, so they are there, okay.
inventory. We do have air travel. It's up at the top of the transportation section there, but we don't count that in our community-based emissions.
I can't read that from here. How many tons?
Looks like it's 3 per household.
Thank you.
And those figures came from the Cal study. Did it dial down to zip code level data, or is this sort of an average for the
We
region?
did it by city.
Okay, great.
had two questions. Can you remind us again how the VMT gets calculated? Was it like trips that began and ended in Albany?
Yes, an excellent question. I get this one every year because it's super confusing. So the way that the VMT calculations work is that for trips that take place within the boundaries of Albany, we get 100% of the miles, which is like 1 mile because we're Albany, but that's fine. For trips that either start in Albany or end in Albany, we get 50% of those miles. So if someone drives from Albany to San Francisco, we get half of that distance attributed to us. But Berkeley and Oakland and the cities in between, they don't get any of those miles attributed. And if someone's driving past us on the highway out to Sacramento, we don't get any of those miles.
And then the second one, just to clarify, I saw something about the EV action plan being in progress. I kind of remembered that one being one where we weren't actively working on it, so I just wanted to see if that was changed.
Yeah, I think that's really in reference to, so the EV action plan, we sort of developed a list of priorities and projects to work on, and then rather than formalizing the plan and going through that process, we started with the multifamily EV charging pilot and just began working on that. So that's sort of the in-progress part of the plan itself. There's some other items from that plan that are kind of still on the table, but we haven't worked on that closely. And there's some things also the subcommittee has been working on that were sort of in that plan and kind of being worked on over time.
Would it be possible, especially with the street tree management plan coming out, to add a KPI in the future for canopy percentage? Canopy percentage?
There is a statement on canopy percentage already in the climate action plan. It doesn't note the specific increase in canopy percentage. It just says a general increase in canopy. And in working on the street management plan myself and talking a lot with the consultants, it's very difficult to create a figure that accurately represents a substantial increase in canopy, essentially, because that was something I was also curious about. I was like, can we leave this plan having said that we increased by 15% canopy? And I was told it would be a lot lower. It would be below the 6 or 5 range % increase. But that is something that I'd like to pay attention to. So if it's something that we can incorporate into the street tree management plan and then build into the climate action plan, that would be interesting.
Yeah, or maybe if there's some other metric that is more useful. I mean, maybe it's number of trees planted or something like that. That might be something as we develop the plan we can take a look at. And I'm sure that plan will include some kind of metrics that we could work into this presentation on a yearly basis as well.
Thank you. I had one more. Sutton, you were mentioning the figures about transit ridership, being interested in, steps that could be taken to increase them. From the staff perspective, is there like a next step, like such as asking transportation committee, or you already have something in your work plan about investigating how to increase transit ridership?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think it's difficult for one, because we're trying to understand where the VMT miles are coming from, because that's obviously contributing a massive percentage of the transportation emissions. And understanding how people are commuting is another thing that we're looking into. Having all of those miles assigned to Albany when someone is commuting into the city for work or into Albany for work isn't something that may reflect the total emissions of Albany, so that's kind of a hurdle that we're trying to get over. But I know that the transportation department is actively working on ways to mitigate emissions. So the active transportation plan is going to be the main focal point of that, which is in its development phase, and that'll include probably most of the ideas that we've already come up with, all encompassing. But aside from that, I know Michelle has been working on some other projects in terms of incentivizing active transportation and commuter transportation. Or the
Yeah,
stuff.
that's more of an employee thing right now, but yeah, yeah, we're working on some commuter benefits for city employees, which is smaller scale, but something. But yeah, I mean, I think part of it's difficult because there's only so much we can do on a city level when it comes to these, regional transportation agencies and the decisions that they make about routes and whatnot. But, we're constantly looking at things we can do to increase access to BART and hopefully get more people riding transit, trying to improve our bus shelters and bus stops and, those sorts of things. Trying to increase active transit is a huge part of what the transportation department is doing. But I think that's also, kind of part of our ongoing work and trying to think of new ideas, so.
Thank you. Okay.
But I thought you guys weren't going to ask any questions, so.
I think we're ready for public comment.
Great. I'm going to move over to public comment. And the first person may begin when you're ready.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle, and our Civic Spark person. Sorry, I forgot your name. Really appreciate this presentation. I actually, wish we could get this kind of wrap up maybe twice a year. But again, it's quite a lot of effort, and it's good to see certain things. I get a little worried about two aspects. One is the 45 zero emission is not a good goal anymore. The science has changed since 2019. It's gotten smarter, and the next 4 to 8 years are super, super critical. So, I get a little worried about, we see this line, hey, it looks like it's doing okay, we can do whatever. We're really in a worse state. So again, this comes back to the urgency and the crisis. One thing, we've sort of hit the low-hanging fruit, the community choice aggregator, 100%, all that. That's really good. A little bit of greenwashing going on there, but still that's good. The existing building emissions is going to be a huge, 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 huge hurdle. And I think that's something that is not going to, you're not going to implement one thing, and we're chipping away at it, certainly with the heat pump response. I wish I could see my clock. I can't see the clock at all. If there's a way I could see the clock, I'd appreciate it. Anyway, I still think there's an important need to start some sort of evaluation in a sale doing something, which is the first start, because then the program will eventually get to where just buildings in general need to have a certain reduction in emissions, or we won't make it. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So you need to start that. It'll take years to roll out. We're not doing anything about it. We're just watching it and going, gee, isn't that great? The other thing I wanted to say is I think with 3 megawatts of solar rooftop in the city, that probably had a pretty good impact on the reduced reduced electrical use. And then the direct community-based emissions are all included in that consumption chart. If you look, you see them all there. So, and I applaud the canopy tracking. I think a number of net new trees planted would be good. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to our next public comment. You may begin when you're ready.
This is Lucinda Young, and I want to thank both of you for an excellent presentation. I remember Lizzie did this presentation, I don't know, maybe a couple years ago, and I was struck at that time, and I am struck again with the fact that our consumption-based emissions are 6 times our community-based emissions, and I don't think there's a lot of, or much widespread awareness of that. And I think there needs to be more education around the emissions associated with our consumption, and really encouraging reduction and reuse as part of individual and community action to reduce our emissions. I did have a couple of comments. I think, first, I agree with Nick Peterson's comment earlier that 2045 is way too late. As some or most of you may know, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says the next 7 years are really, really critical and are going to determine the future of, what we do in the next 7 years is absolutely critical. So I would encourage us to move that timeline up from 2045 and not get too comfortable with the fact that we're on target for meeting a 2045 goal. I did have a couple of questions. I'm wondering how we determine the number of EVs in Albany. Is it just based on PG&E data as to who selects the EV rate plan? Just curious how we came up with that. And I also wanted to comment on the waste information. I think there's a dire need for more education in the community about waste. I think a lot of people, I saw the recycling numbers went down. And frankly, a lot of people are just so confused about recycling. And it's recycling of plastics is the confusion. I think some people have just given up and they're just putting it in the landfill. So I would encourage the CAC, the city, to really do some more outreach on waste management. And anyway, great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I believe that is all for public comment.
Okay, now it's time for discussion.
I just had one I wanted to start with. It sounded like one data gap was around some on the municipal emission side, and one was transportation. Tying it into some of the previous comments we got around the procurement choices around, getting this gas vehicle, and kind of one of the items we have, hoping to push for a fleet target. Like one good proxy KPI, or at least indicator, could be composition of fleet and how electric, how that is moving over as well, in kind of the absence of VMT data. So just want to put that out there.
I just wanted to comment that I was really happy to see the increase in electric vehicle purchases in Albany, but I was kind of surprised at the number of charging stations installed. It seemed like it was flat or even maybe down from last year, which is kind of a head scratcher. Like how could there be that many more EVs with that many, not that many more charging stations? So, the zero emission transportation subcommittee's been looking at different options for charging station deployment. So I just want to double down on that, I think that more charging stations in the city will help support more vehicle adoption. For whatever reason, there's not that many charging stations getting installed. So, I know we've all been working on that. So just wanted to put a plug in for keeping going on that.
That number was, those were private charger permits?
Yeah, so we did have a number for the number of private, home EV chargers permitted, which I think was 33.
Okay.
And then public chargers was flat this past year. I think we're at 4.
It is worth noting, and in efforts to try and collaborate and compare data with nearby cities, there's been a regional increase in public chargers. So hopefully we can get some data looking at Berkeley, looking at El Cerrito, and see if their increase in public chargers has shifted their EV numbers at all. So that could be something that we use as well.
One thing just to keep in note too with the EV chargers is not all of them have to be permitted. Like a lot of the lower level ones, you can pretty much plug in and ready to go. So it might not represent all the public chargers that are, private chargers that are out there.
That's definitely true. I'll also just note, there was a question in the public comments about how we got the number for electric vehicles, and that's coming essentially from the DMV. We get the data from the California Air Resources Board. They have a dashboard, but the data comes from the DMV itself, so it's pretty specific, which is nice.
I'd really be curious to hear from everyone, like, given the figures we've seen, how does that guide your judgment on what our priorities should be in the coming 6 months to a year?
I guess I'll just say that I was really surprised by the HVAC, the heat pump furnaces number. That totally flipped of where I would have thought it would have been compared to water heaters, because from my personal experience, water heater was pretty, like the contractor knew what to do, and it was pretty easy. The HVAC is like a little bit, that's more of an investment and it's more complicated. So anyway, I was super happy to hear that. But I think that the incentive programs probably helped a lot, and just both in the communication and the financial assistance, just having a little bit of help to make it that much closer to parity with gas, I think was it seems like it's been a really good program, and I know that we've gone through a cycle of re-upping it, and so just kudos to staff for the programs you've been doing, and not just the incentive, but the communication. I think it just really, that helps.
It was a good reminder for me about how big a slice of the pie transportation is. So that was just something that I am thinking about. And clearly it should be a priority because it's where the emissions are.
I was also thinking about transportation, since I remember I'm thinking of like the pie chart right now, and about like a good portion of it was about transportation. And I think like for me, what was really interesting and what I was really, kind of thinking about was also public transportation and how that's shifted over time. And just thinking of like how many people do drive within the local area, even though it is a walkable city. So that's kind of stuff that I'm thinking about, especially as like, I recently learned how to drive, and I'm looking at all the people who are driving, and they tend to also be about my age, like younger people. So that's also something I was thinking about, like how can we reduce, especially new drivers who, like high school students who are getting their license, how can we reduce that congestion in Albany to reduce overall kind of emissions from transportation and increase public transportation instead.
Yes, I appreciated the reminder about the consumption-based emissions, because even though they are so much harder for us to track, whatever we can do on that front is sort of more squarely within our wheelhouse. Like the transportation thing is obviously number one, and can be hard sometimes to share, like what part is ours and what part can we influence. But whatever's consumption-based and isn't transportation, we could keep chipping away at any of those. Because the rest of the bars, I feel like, that weren't transportation on that were somewhat equivalent in size. Which is cool, because I think a lot of this stuff is sort of backgrounded. Things like, oh, how do you reduce, like, the new goods people are buying? Like, oh my God. That's not, like, there's no easy answer there, but it is interesting to see how important that actually is on our total emissions. Any more?
Maybe I'll add a comment about a news item. We've been faced with kind of a headwind because on an equivalent energy basis, electricity is a lot more expensive than natural gas, like a factor of 6. This has nothing to do with AVA, they're just charging for the electricity, but PG&E's rates include so many things that are not related to providing electricity, like wildfires and compensation for wildfire victims and so on. And there's potentially very good news coming on that score. By July 1st, the PUC is, by state law, going to restructure PG&E's rates. PG&E will be made whole. Everybody agrees that PG&E is just soaking up too much money. So everybody has agreed that we have to do something about that. And just about all the parties agree that there are too many public policy things that should not be paid for through utility bills at all, but instead through general taxes. Putting those to the side, PUC has a plan where the fee to be connected to PG&E will be a flat fee per month that will be based on household income somehow. And the rate per kilowatt hour will drop somewhat, maybe substantially. And this will help us a lot in terms of promoting EVs, because it'll be cheaper to recharge them, and it'll be easier to promote heat pumps, induction stoves, et cetera. Anything that uses electricity will become cheaper and will start to look better compared to natural gas economically. Thank you. By the way, there's a good article about that. I'd be happy to send it to the committee and post it. Anyway, thanks. I'll do that.
I wanted to highlight something we heard the public commenters saying. Both, they gave the figure of 7 to 8 years being a timeline in which there is an urgency to act. And I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts about, like, what are the implications of that if our climate action plan has us getting to net zero on a slower timeline? What does that say to you in terms of not only what should we prioritize, but like with what sort of force or energy we should prioritize it, or like how to make a bigger, faster push? Curious if anyone has any thoughts on that.
If I could comment, there's at least two arenas to address that sort of thing. One is at the city level. The other is that the Sacramento is considering whether to extend the state's cap and trade program, and the nitty-gritty of how many allowances are going to be issued and so on. But that's going to have a potentially significant impact on the future trajectory of emissions in this state. I don't have a sense of what's going on in Sacramento enough to make any sort of prediction, but it seems like the range of possibilities is quite broad. So I guess that just to continue, so we could potentially ask the city council to send a letter to our representatives in Sacramento. It's another way to deal with this.
Any other thoughts on that or any other discussion? All right. Thank you so much, you guys. Thank you for that awesome and very extensive analysis. All right, so we are on to item 6.1, the Sustainable Foodware Ordinance update.
Yes, I will be taking over here and giving some updates on research, outreach, and a general timeline. Give me a second to share my screen. There we go. I know you all are very interested in the status of our sustainable foodware development, so I'm hoping to provide some context and information on what it's looking like and the timeline. As quick background, obviously it was laid out in both our climate action plan and our general plan to reduce waste and to specifically develop some type of sustainable foodware ordinance focused at dine-in restaurants and creating foodware that isn't going to be contributing to the landfill. The bill I mentioned in the previous presentation, SB 54, is currently in process as well, currently in a working draft and comment period, and it's going to require some large reductions in plastic packaging, as well as a lot more transparency from the actual producers of said packaging, i.e. restaurants or vendors or anyone that's producing plastic, essentially, over the foodware packaging. And then California State Requirement 1200 also impacts fiber-based foodware packaging, avoiding certain chemicals and PFAS that would be harmful. Another slight background update. I showed this chart last time. I did update our tonnages of commercial landfill from this past year, which obviously has been going down, but we want to keep reducing that number. And we know that rigid plastic food serviceware is making up 1.3% equivalent in the statewide characterization, which doesn't seem like a lot, but is a lot. So we're working at addressing that through this policy development. And then I'll just fly quickly through the different characterizations. I always have to remind myself, landfill disposables, single-use plastic items, most of what you'd be getting for takeout, silverware, anything that has plastic, or anything that is fully plastic. The compostable plastics are the more complicated ones, the PLA line materials or plant-based plastics or bioplastics. While promising in certain composting facilities or certain composting situations, for Albany it really isn't an option because we're not able to break down these PLA plastics at our facilities. So it's something that's more confusing customers and restaurants than anything. And what we're trying to move towards is a fiber-based sustainable foodware and ordinance. It's natural, it either is paper or bamboo-based, it breaks down and contributes to a really healthy compost stream. Yeah. So moving into what we've been working on, a lot of the outreach and research has been speaking with other cities and speaking with other community groups and organizations. Rethink Disposable has already made a tremendous impact in Alameda County and in the city of Alameda in offering small businesses technical assistance and financial assistance, is making the shift to fully 100% reusables for dine-in. It's both recommendations on limiting the amount of foodware that they're using or accessory items, and also financial incentives and mini grants to fund the purchasing of these items that they're recommending. Yeah, and then SF has also picked up a similar idea where it was a city-funded grant to help with the purchasing of reusables. I included two of the case studies from Rethink Disposable just because I think they really highlighted the current missed opportunity that Albany has right now with foodware. And it's truly exemplifying the potential reductions in emissions and potential reductions in waste that we can see if we implement something that is pretty minor. So this is a case study of House of Dim Sum in San Francisco. You can see this is something that they provided to the business and data that they collected. Some pretty impressive statistics here. The payback period specifically for this restaurant was only 1.7 weeks. So that's how long it took for them to get their money back after this initial investment, which was pretty impressive. And then the other thing I want to highlight here is the 7.2 tons of annual waste reduction that was made just for this one restaurant, would translate already to around 2 metric tons of CO2. So in seeing this at an individual restaurant and having those tangible results is something that I think is very inspiring and something we should continue to pursue. The only other one I want to highlight here focused on a returnable system, which I thought was very impressive. It required a much less financial investment, but proved that the returnable, reusable system showed some promise. It's obviously something we have a lot less data on, and there's a lot less systems in place for it, but staff reported a return rate of 75%, and we're able to make money on it and able to reduce waste, which at the end of the day is the win-win that we're going for. Another piece of the collaboration efforts has been working with one of these companies, specifically Deliver Zero. Deliver Zero has partnered with Stop Waste in implementing their services to Alameda County. How Deliver Zero works is it is a reusable to-go foodware program. It's compatible with Uber Eats, DoorDash, as well as will just be in-house at the restaurants. And there's a charge for customers in the app, and then a charge in person, which is a little bit less. And then they are able to return at several different Whole Foods locations at their door via a pickup or back at the restaurant within a certain amount of time. I forget the specific date. But this program, there's several others like them around the country. It's difficult to see which one has shown the most promise, but the fact that Stop Waste is backing this one is something that we think is important, and is offering an $1,000 incentive for free Deliver Zero services for the first 25 businesses that join. So we've been in active discussions with Deliver Zero on how we can facilitate that with restaurants, because there's several restaurants that are interested, and they know that it's something that will attract customers who care about the environment as well. Moving on to more general collaboration that we've been working on, a ton of other agencies and governments in the area are focusing on a similar thing. There is a regional foodware working group that has been actively meeting, discussing their different struggles, their different obstacles that they've been facing, and different suggestions. As I mentioned prior, SB 54 is currently open for a comment period, which is ending next week. So we are going to work on reviewing that draft, submitting our concerns and questions to make sure that it applies to our city. And then working with cities and counties that have developed the ordinance that we already want to see. County of Marin, for example, has developed an excellent fiberware ordinance. It has some exemptions for products that are not there yet, but we've spoken with them, and through an extensive education campaign, they were able to implement it and work with a lot of businesses, so it wasn't this daunting a feat to overcome. The last thing I'll mention, which is really been impressive from the County of San Mateo, is their Foodware Aware program. They created a purchasing guide that can be used by restaurants, can be used by cities. That is just a small screenshot from it to see what it looks like. That doesn't even actually include all of the categories. It's very detailed and very impressive. And I think one of the biggest hurdles for ourselves in making this research and for businesses is understanding what they're purchasing, comparing it from a financial perspective, and comparing it to see if it's actually having an environmental impact. And if we can reduce or lower the number of those calculations that businesses have to do in their head and ease that transition, I think it'll make this development a lot easier. Next, I'm just going to give some background on some of our outreach and research results. We conducted a foodware survey. We had a total of, I think it was 12 or 13 responses from restaurants in Albany, trying to understand what the main obstacles they were facing with transitioning to fully dine-in reusables or just more sustainable foodware, and then also just gauge an inventory on what they were working with now. One of the main takeaways we had is that dine-in reusable is definitely something that we can work towards. It's feasible in the grand scheme of things. Most restaurants are already working with around like 85 to 90%. Those are just my estimates of reusables. It's very minor transitions that would have to be made and limited amounts of funding in accessories or cups. It's not making a full-scale transition like you've seen in other situations. So focusing on those accessories and that technical assistance is going to be something that we're going to be looking into a little bit more. These are some of the other survey results that we got. 83% of restaurants claimed that product cost was the #1 priority when considering the fiber-based alternative to the plastic that they were most likely purchasing. Plastic was the most used material, followed by a tie between the compostable plastics and the fiber-based compostables. What that tells us really is that there's still this confusion around compostability and compostable plastics. So while we're pushing this campaign to develop policy, at the same time we want to be very resource forward and educate the public, educate these restaurants on what we should be using. Some other general feedback that we were getting, again, a request for education, some cost-effective green options, and then concerns over the specific product or material and it being inferior to plastic for carrying certain items or for certain food items, which we'll talk a little bit about more. The next thing that staff has been working on in order to work with businesses and get some more information is a pilot program. We've received interest from a couple of restaurants in working with the city. The city is happy to fund a variety of different possible pilot programs, and we're trying to pool resources and incentives at the moment, and we've been consistently meeting with Rethink and Deliver Zero to think about ways to create a pilot program that makes the most sense for informing our ordinance and for assisting the businesses with making this transition. So the funding can go towards a restaurant simply making the transition to become 100% dine-in. It can also go towards giving them sustainable foodware such as fiberware or paper-based items to try out for a certain amount of time. Say it was 2 to 4 weeks to see if it worked with their operations, get some customer feedback, stuff like that. Some of the questions we're looking at, what are the main difficulties or obstacles that they're facing for the reusable transition? Is it dishwashing capacity? Is it staff labor? Is it customer reaction? Is it price? These are some of the things we're trying to get a better idea of. We already have some responses to this through our outreach and through our survey, but having a specific restaurant be able to talk to us would be great. Public and restaurant attitude towards some of the fiber-based and reusable programs. And then as well as effectiveness of incentives and negative incentives or charges. The most common example of this is a 25-cent charge for disposable cups, which we've seen in other regional ordinances, but it's unclear whether it's really moving the needle. So that's something we want to pay attention to. The next portion of the presentation, I wanted to give some context on each of the categories that we're looking at before diving into some questions and concerns and guidance that we're looking for from you all. So the first is context on the reusable dine-in situation. We are looking at various different requirement options. It could be that vendors must use reusable foodware containers and utensils. There could be an element of accessories items only being available by request, or fiber-based accessories only available as opposed to the plastic ones. Some financial considerations. This is from Rethink. It can range anywhere from $100 to $2,000 to make that initial transition. Again, according to my information and outreach with the cities, I think that's very much going to be on the lower end. And then there's varying payback periods and then inventory resets as well. So we don't know how long it's going to take for the business to immediately see those benefits, and we can't give them any false promises. At the same time, we don't know all of the restaurants' specific inventory cycles and when they're going to run out of their plastic or compostable plastic inventory or utensils. And then dishwashing and labor capacity are also a piece of this puzzle. And then different enforcement mechanisms are something we've been looking at. it's very tough from a small local perspective on enforcing an ordinance like this, because it will most likely have to be a complaint-based system. That's what's happened in the county of San Mateo, and obviously I have slightly more resources there. So this is something that we're going to have to think about once passing the ordinance, is how are we actually going to get people to abide by this, and what's the best way to go about that. And we're obviously going to pay attention to different exemptions that we may have in low income or new businesses or new restaurants. And then quick context for the sustainable takeout. We think the ordinance should be revolved around fiber-based materials. The PLA and compostable plastics seem to just complicate the situation from all of the research we've been doing, as well as statewide guidance and statewide laws are pushing us away from those. So SB 1335 and SB 54, PFAS-free, we're just looking at products that are free of these chemicals and safe to use, and then the compostability of them. They have different standards from the statewide level, and it's, I think, accepted at more than 50% of statewide composting facilities. But if we really want to make an impact at the local level, the fiber-based option is the best place to go. Looking at the financials, the price of fiberware versus plastic, in most businesses and most restaurants' minds, what we've kind of gathered is that they're afraid to make the more sustainable choice because in the past, there haven't been as many financially sound options. What we're learning, especially with the purchasing guide provided by San Mateo, is there's a variety of options they can choose from that the slight difference is not too substantial. Even some are a little bit less. So we're trying to compare that with the actual quality of the product to see whether we're allowed to require it and whether it'd be asking too much of the businesses. And then lastly, looking at the feasibility of adoption, the product availability, whether there's a market for it at the moment, whether there's products that we can ask the businesses to go buy that will work for their business. And then education and enforcement on those compostable requirements is something that we are keeping in mind. We are going to come back to this, but I just wanted to breeze over it. This is kind of one of the main questions we have for you all that's related to reusables and sustainable takeout, is how strict we want our policy, our ordinance to be. So on the scale of incentives, positive or negative, essentially a slap on the wrist as a 25-cent charge, all the way to the opposite end of the spectrum, which would be a full 100% requirement. This is for, say, reusable dine-in. Where do we want to sit on that scale of enforcement? How do we want to navigate that relationship with restaurants, given what we know? The other area of strictness that we're looking at are exemptions, whether we want them to be more or less expansive. They can be product-based, food-based, income-based. There's a ton of different ways to look at the different products that aren't satisfying what the restaurant actually needs. So we can go about that in many different ways. I think the main one has been product-based, which is updated according to as products become available that meet businesses' needs or meet restaurants' needs. That's the current, I think, model for other cities. And then another strictness thing we're paying attention to is the level of city support, whether it's going to be just technical assistance, whether it's going to be minor funding, whether it's going to be major funding, whether it's going to be totally hands-off. Where should we use our resources to best help this transition? And then enforcement timeline. This can be something that goes into effect in the span of a year, in the span of 6 months. We want to work through whether the first portion of it is going to be largely education and resource forwardness, and then when are we actually going to start implementing it and enforcing it and giving fines or implementing the complaint-based system, essentially. So we'll come back to that, but just keep that in mind. And then questions for context for reusable takeouts. This is the other category we're looking at. It's something that is more difficult to require. There just isn't a system in place at the moment for the reusable takeout system. So there's a couple things that we want to look at here, one of which is the general promotion of customers to bring their own reusables and containers is something that we want to make very clear. It's something that can still happen regardless of the ordinance, regardless of pilot programs. So that's something that we want to make aware to the public and to the committee. And then looking at different charges for disposables or discounts for reusables. The charges, like I mentioned before, can be 25 cents for a disposable cup, but we can also implement something in our ordinance that gives discounts for customers that bring reusables. So if you're bringing in your container to your favorite restaurant and you know you're going to be back there, giving a 25-cent discount is something that we could potentially do in order to encourage reusables. Some of the financial considerations, as I mentioned before, the incentive from Deliver Zero, and then the cost of operating the reusable system. Some of them can just be in-house. They can be operated fully by the restaurant themselves. If it's a coffee house, for example, and they have customers bringing in their own coffee mugs, it's very simple. But in cases where they need containers, that brings in companies like Deliver Zero, where there's a slight fee, which we can get into later. And then just some general concerns to keep in mind and stuff that we've been paying attention to is restaurant and customer attitude towards these different measures. Some restaurants have given feedback that they don't want customers paying an additional fee to use reusables. So that's just kind of an obstacle we've been facing. And then the effectiveness of incentives and charges and whether it's actually moving the needle is something that we're also looking at. And then this is what we'll come back to as well for the reusable takeout. But the main thing that we're paying attention to and the main feedback that we want from you all is how we should structure the incentive program or incentive policy and what we think the effectiveness of these charges or incentives is going to look like. These are just some examples of the questions that we're thinking about. It can be any type of fee or form of discouragement or encouragement promoting reusables. For the 25-cent disposable cup charge, is it effective in moving the needle? Are cups the right container to focus on? How is this affecting customer relationships with the business if we implement these charges? It's a very difficult thing for staff to figure out. I've been doing a lot of research on it and talking with other cities and regional agencies. There isn't substantial data on whether it's hurting or helping too much. It's more of a new policy, so it's one that we're going to have to navigate. So we'll come back to this and talk through that. And then the last thing I just want to leave you all with, because this really helps my understanding of how we're going to frame the ordinance and what we have to consider when we're implementing it. The priorities are hopefully working towards requiring reusable dine-in. Most restaurants in Albany are already near that metric, but pushing them over that edge so that there is no disposables or single-use disposable waste would be great. And then requiring fiber-based takeout or recommending it. The asterisk is there for the exemptions. Like we found, if there is, say, hot soup that is just not working with the fiber-based compostables, the PLA lining, for example, the reason why it's placed on the paper-based or fiber-based products is because it protects it from that heat. We have found other fiberware products that works well, but working through that is something that we want to prioritize. And then obviously encouraging and promoting reusables. And then the three categories that I kind of break it up in my mind: feasibility, is it functional? Is it going to work for the product? Is it going to work for the food? Is there product that's available for the restaurant? Looking through this at a lens of equity and customer and restaurant impact. There's going to be exemptions for low-income businesses. There's going to be exemptions for businesses that models don't fit the scheme of our ordinance, but also understanding restaurants' concerns with customer relations, I think, is something. And then lastly, which is very, very important, is the deliverables. Are we actually going to see a shift in the diversion rate? Are we going to see a reduction in the emissions because we are having this impact? And how are we going to enforce it? How are we going to make sure that businesses are making the shift? Is it going to be through incentives? Is it going to be through requirements? Yeah. So as a presentation, we will take questions and then go back into a discussion, and we could jump through the slides. But thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
The nice presentation. Thanks very much. Great research. It's always interesting on this committee to get it to have an insight into the complexity of any little topic like this. I mean, it's like, it's like, yeah, we should get rid of takeout plastic. No, it's not that easy. Did you have any data about the amount of disposables that were used in dine-in versus takeout? I mean, I guess I was frankly surprised that dine-in was such a big part of this presentation, and I kind of assumed takeout was the big problem. But I'm trying to check my assumption. So, do you have data on which is the bigger source of plastic or whatever?
The bigger source is definitely as you'd assume, the takeout foodware and single-use disposables. We did ask that question as we were pushing the foodware survey to restaurants. We're getting a general inventory. What we found surprisingly is that none of them were at the fully 100% reusable dine-in. So kind of our strategy is a two-pronged approach of helping them make that last transition, which we think is going to be a lot easier than having them switch their inventory to sustainable products from the single-use disposables. But we do have some data on that. I can pull that up.
Sorry, but you said takeout is a larger portion of the waste stream than dine-in, right?
Yes, yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I wrote down some stuff to discuss during the discussion, but for questions, when you were discussing, I think it was like the 13 places that were surveyed, how were those, can you remind me how those were determined as like sample, like as a sample?
For the foodware survey, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, we just pushed the survey to as many restaurants that would want to answer. So we were trying to get as general a sense as possible. And while that number doesn't seem that high, there's actually not that many restaurants in Albany, and then 2 chains that don't really apply to our situation as much. But yeah, that's how we came up with that number.
You had a number in there that was something about like a couple $100 to a $2,000. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it seemed like, what was that based on? I mean, that was like some sort of like transition cost or something like that. But
yeah,
can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, definitely. That was part of Rethink Disposables' technical assistance and their data from those case studies, neither of which were in the city of Albany. They haven't worked with any businesses here yet. One was from the city of Alameda, and then one was from the city of San Francisco. So we were looking at a larger scale regardless, but what those figures were referring to was the cost of, so Rethink Disposable only focuses on dine-in. So what they were assisting with was the shift to 100% dine-in foodware, and that those figures varied for restaurants that were at different stages of already having reusables. So for the one that was the larger number, around the 2,000 metric, they needed to replace a lot of their current operations. I forget how they currently served, but it was a lot of smaller paper-based products, plastic, like sauce packets, plastic sauce containers, stuff like that. But there was a couple other case studies on the restaurant that's very, very interesting, because there's things like pizza parlors or coffee shops that require $80 to make this entire transition, and what it translates to in savings for the restaurant is unbelievable. So we really want to present this data to restaurants in Albany to be like, this isn't too difficult for you to do. We'll help make it happen, and you'll save a ton of money as well.
On the Stop Waste, Deliver Zero incentives, do we know Sort of how many of those might be available to Albany restaurants?
It's currently for the first 25 in, I believe, Alameda County is their push. We're talking back and forth with Deliver Zero about how to get those restaurants in touch with them. And in keeping our pilot program as open and vague as possible, we're hoping that we can attract businesses to pick up reusable takeout programs like that. So if they get the $1,000 incentive from Deliver Zero and the first monthly cost of working with Deliver Zero, it's actually on a usage rate. So for however many customers are using the Deliver Zero packages, that's what they're getting charged. If customers don't order and don't use these Deliver Zero packages, the restaurants won't be charged. So if that last hurdle is something that's too daunting for them, the city's looking into ways that we can cover that for the first month or cover that for the first 2 months so that we can get some really helpful data and they can try it out with customers as well.
I had one question around, some of this financial support and technical help that's being discussed. I guess, how does that get, guaranteed to the business? I'm assuming that part's not in the actual ordinance itself, so I guess I'm just saying, how do you build trust with the businesses that this support will be there for them if they support this ordinance?
Yeah, we're not giving them, we're trying not to frame it as giving them financial assistance or financial incentives if they support the ordinance and if they work with us. It's more being resource and financial incentive forward, and we're giving this to them regardless of what they want to do going forwards. The whole idea of all of this outreach and all of this research is so that we don't spring a ordinance upon businesses that doesn't work for them and makes their business impossible to operate. So all of this is just for our own knowledge. And there's a ton of funding available, not just from our perspective, but from Rethink, from Deliver Zero, from other smaller operations that give these businesses a lot of help in making the transition. So yeah.
Also, I'll just say from a logistical standpoint, the pilot projects that we're working on, we're in discussions with a couple of businesses right now trying to launch these. And they're all pretty small scale. We're talking about, buying sample fiber-based disposables for like a month or something. We're talking about a few $100s here, so that's something that we're actually just able to spend from our community development budget. It doesn't have to go to council. There's not some big process. It's just something that we can kind of do like at a one-on-one level with the business owners. So that really simplifies and allows for a lot more trust and communication.
As you look to expanding this to more restaurants, I'm wondering, what are the standard practices and politics around giving those restaurants a heads up that you're thinking about an ordinance, you're researching an ordinance that's on the horizon, no timeline yet, so maybe you really want to take a look at this cool free stuff. How do you communicate that?
Yeah, our thinking is that some of our outreach in the very beginning stages of it, which is all the stuff we've already been doing, is gonna hopefully start to remind them, but also educating them on the stuff that's out of our control, which is like the statewide measures that are upcoming, I think is really, really important. And then the other thing I want to mention is even after all of this outreach, the actual policy development and when it's put in place can involve an education campaign. The County of Marin, which I mentioned before, which implemented a fiber-based ordinance, as well as a ton of their, I think 8 out of 9 of their cities or something, they included a 8-month education campaign or something like that before doing any kind of enforcement. So that was a large component of it, and they provided outreach materials, communication materials for the restaurants. A lot of this stuff that I feel like we're doing behind the scenes now, they did after, so I think this is just preparing us even more.
Thank you. Any more questions? All right, we're ready for public comment.
will begin with our first public comment.
Thank you. This is Lucinda Young. I want to thank you for an excellent presentation, both your presentation tonight, and I also read your very thorough memo before the meeting today, very well researched, and I'm very, very impressed. I feel that this is a very important for our city to pass an ordinance along these lines. And I know we talked about the importance of, from the standpoint of reducing our landfill, but there's another aspect, and that's litter, that this plastic foodware is, our city is being littered by this stuff. I was really struck during the rains recently, was walking along Washington Avenue, and there was a, flowing stream from the rain in the gutter, and I was just appalled by the amount of plastic foodware. And I have a bag, pickup bag for my dog, and I'm like picking up as much of it as I can as I'm walking, but it's like it felt like a needle in a haystack. So there's and all of that waste ends up going into our drains, draining out to our bay, Albany Beach, and the El Cerrito Bay Trail are just, it's appalling if you go during low tide and see all the plastic litter, the foodware litter, the spoons and forks and straws and cups. So I feel that this is a really important ordinance. And I agree that focusing on getting, for dine-ins, requiring reusable should be a priority. First of all, there's not the economic hit that there is with requiring takeout. So I think that is a priority, and I am surprised at the number of dine-in restaurants that are still using some single-use disposables. So I agree with focusing on that first. And I think requiring a charge for disposable cups makes a lot of sense. 25 cents, whether that's enough to get attention, I don't know, but we may want to up that more. And also, I really like the idea of requiring a discount for customers who bring their own containers. I bring my own containers into restaurants. I definitely get some looks, but most restaurants will refill if you bring your own containers. And there is a state law now that alleviates any concern that the restaurants have that they're violating health policy or something. There's a state law that says restaurants can refill customers' containers. So anyway, I fully support this. Thank you for all the great work.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to our next public comment.
Yeah, Nick Peterson with Albany Climate Action Coalition. Yeah, thank you for all.
Nick, your audio seems to have cut out.
Yeah, it popped up, so I'll start again. But anyway, it looks like there's a lot of good resources out there. Some other municipalities have blazed the trail. I just encourage you to move quickly. I like the idea that you would do some outreach to, I'm sure there are several of the local restaurants that would be very interested in partnering up and being a pilot project if it's done correctly and they feel they're getting supported on that. So I encourage you to move quickly, line those up, get the pilot project done, sort of sort out the specifics that would apply to the Albany situation. But again, as someone mentioned, we don't have a ton of restaurants here, but I think it would, if we make that change and all our citizens and people that come to Albany realize, hey, they're on the ball with this. They have these nice fiber-based products at their restaurants. I think it, you could even market it to, and maybe you should look into providing some sort of graphic that initially the test case restaurants could put in their windows saying, hey, we're completely zero plastic and sustainable recyclable foodware. I mean, there's a way to really play it up and make it something that could be even a business asset for them. So I wouldn't overlook that. And if Albany gets known for successfully implementing that, that would be great. I know Berkeley has tried this, and you'll go to some places in Berkeley and they won't be complying, and the enforcement's very difficult, much bigger city, many more restaurants. But I think Albany would have the chance to really shine and get all their food service businesses on board. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll move on to our last public comment.
Hi, good evening. Ian McLeod. I'm a member of the Planning and Zoning Commission. I am thinking of this also through the lens of what we approve occasionally at the Planning and Zoning Commission, which is temporary pop-up events. One specific example comes to mind, which was the Foodie Land night market at the Golden Gate Fields parking lot, which had 100 food trucks. They had 3 or 4 events per year. And we, tried to impose our conditions of approval, some of which was recycling and, reusable containers, compostable, et cetera. But it would be really helpful if there was an ordinance that applied also to temporary events, to food trucks. It could be applicable to the Solano Avenue stroll. I don't know how much waste is generated there. You're having a lot of people taking takeout, those kind of things. So having guidelines in place would really help us as a Planning and Zoning Commission when we approve these kind of events, that we can say, just follow this ordinance adopted by the City of Albany that covers this subject in terms of reusability, compostability, and it should apply to more than just restaurants. There are other temporary events, running events, races, things where they also use these kind of disposable cups. I've been to plenty of running races where they set a whole bunch of plastic cups out on tables, and they end up getting thrown in the street, wherever runners drop them, that sort of thing. I think all this stuff could apply. So, I really applaud your effort. I support it, what you're doing, and would encourage you to broaden it a little bit to more events that are temporary in nature, and food trucks, even the Solano Stroll, guidelines for all those vendors and food servers. That would be really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I believe that is all for the public comment.
Moving on to discussion of this item.
Great, and we thought that it might be most useful to go back to Sutton's slides with our sort of context and question and walk through them one by one, if that works for the committee.
I see it's 5 minutes to 9. I don't know if we need to extend, but just pointing that out.
It does feel like we won't quite fit everything in, and otherwise, is there a motion to extend our time?
Sure. How much more is on the agenda besides this item?
After this, we have subcommittee updates and future agenda items.
Okay. So how about I suggest we extend till 9:15. That's 20 minutes.
I would second that. Do we need to, maybe for this discussion and skip the subcommittee updates? We wrap all that into one?
Let's ask that. For those giving subcommittee updates, do you want to just indicate about how many minutes you'll need, or if you can skip it? I feel like we don't really have anything different. Let's skip it. So we'll do discussion of this item and future agenda items.
Member Hodges?
Yes.
Member Larson?
Yes.
Member Lieberman?
Yes.
Member Melgen?
Yes.
Chair Vahill McClanahan?
Yes.
Yeah, so we just wanted to pull this slide back up to kind of give a reminder of what we are looking for. There isn't any specific action items at this moment. We're going to be developing the Foodware Ordinance hopefully soon. But yeah, the 2 slides that we're going to pan over here should give us some great information. The strictness of requirements, and then we'll dive into the incentive programs. So yeah.
Is 100% requirement, like, that's like the statement of an ordinance, right? Or is it,
So I think, there's a lot of different routes we could go with an ordinance. It could be an ordinance where we say you're required to have 100% dine and reusables, you're required to have 100% compostable fiber-based disposables. Or we could say we're going to incentivize you in some way. You're going to, get a discount on your business license, or, if you have plastic disposables, then there's an extra tax on that, or, I'm just imagining things. So it's kind of this discussion of like, where along this spectrum do we want to land? Of course, we don't expect like a solid answer, but we're trying to get a sense from you all about what kinds of policies you're interested in seeing as we kind of really dig into the weeds and start developing this.
So I just want to make sure, are you soliciting feedback on this slide now from us? Okay.
Yes, we are.
All right. I want to make sure I'm on the right page. I mean, I have a few thoughts. I feel like on the incentive side, 25 cents, for example, I think, it's a good place to start. Let's say there's 25 cents on a cup. I have the feeling that that wouldn't discourage much consumption of disposable cups. That, on a drink that people are buying, you go to the coffee shop here, you probably spend, I don't know, $3.50 maybe, maybe more, maybe less on a coffee or a cappuccino or whatever. I don't think the extra 25 cents is really going to move the needle. But I would find it interesting if that money was used to have a litter cleanup program or something, sort of getting to Lucinda's comment, like, maybe the purpose of the fee is to make something happen, even if the behavior doesn't change. That's sort of where my mind goes on this, like how strict do we need to be, but also like what's the purpose of a fee or incentive?
Yeah, I had very similar ideas. I mean, as a consumer, also $3.50. I spend $7 on my drinks. I don't know where you got $3.50. But I mean, the point is also like I go in with the assumption that I'm going to spend like $6 on a coffee, and the 25 cents, like I'm already spending $6. So I also agree with more like leaning towards if I went in and I knew that could be cheaper if I brought my own cup, I would be more inclined to do that rather than, I'll just pay an extra, 25 cents, which I hate how it's ringing. How it's like, just purchasing it in itself, it's just like a small additional cost. I think it would need to be raised for people to actually change behavior. I feel like once you hit like the 50 to 75 cent mark is where I would start to be like, that's almost $1. Like that's starting to seem a little more significant than just a quarter. But also, yeah, where is the money going? Like if I am spending this 25 cents extra and all these other people are, because I don't think many people actually change their behavior based on that small kind of incentive not to, like, is that pooled somewhere and then that goes towards sustainability efforts? Or, and it's also important in general for disposables that there is some kind of option for people to be able to take food out and just dispose of it, especially people who work careers that they can't sit down with a plate and eat. So there needs to be some kind of option that's also provided and accessible to the coffee shop or restaurant or cafe or whatever. So there is that kind of middle ground. But I would lean more towards like having some kind of monetary incentives that's a little more significant than 25%. Or at least, yeah, figuring out how that 25 cent is going to be accumulated over everyone and then used towards a specific sustainability effort within that place.
I have some fear that a high fee would discourage business in Albany. Albany's very small. You don't have to go very far to Kensington Circle or Upper Solano or wherever to get out of Albany. If there was like $1 a cup fee, I think people might think I might as well just stop in one of those areas. But I don't know, but just the higher the fee, I think the greater likelihood that the Albany businesses would lose business if the same fee was not imposed in neighboring cities.
Do we know right now where the money actually goes? Like that fee, does that just go towards the shop wherever they want to spend it?
Yeah, generally that's the case, that the business gets to keep the money. There's also a 25-cent fee in Berkeley right now. I don't think there's anything in El Cerrito.
I mean, I'd love to see us make the most change the fastest. And my sense from the questions and answers so far is that would be maybe focusing on takeout where, and while it's true that cups are also takeout where, maybe a more holistic look at focusing on takeout where, I mean, not necessarily to the exclusion of the dine-in, but it kind of sounded like the dine-in was maybe like this big of a piece and the takeout was maybe this big of a piece. So maybe if we put most of our efforts toward that, and even maybe most of our figuring this out efforts toward that, toward the takeout where.
The related question, which is, I understand that restaurants in California are not supposed to bring out water without asking, if you dine in. Is there a similar law that they shouldn't be giving you disposable ware unless you ask for it? I can't remember if that does exist. Okay, cool.
Yeah, there is a law that basically saying that accessories should only be available upon request. It's not really enforced in any way, so several cities have passed a similar ordinance with more of an enforcement mechanism behind it.
I was thinking about the continuum that you were asking about, and this is similar to other things we've faced, and it seems like, number one, the city needs to make a statement about a policy or an ordinance. Here's where we're going to, and then there's an implementation timeline, and you start with incentives, and then you go to enforcement, and so you give people a chance to, especially the businesses, a chance to accommodate and figure out how they're going to work this into their. So it feels to me like there's a part that is a city ordinance, so it's a statement, and like Ian said in the public comment, then you have the flexibility of saying, here's our policy, here's what it is. You're a temporary, you're an event or whatever, here's our policy. And then we figure out what the enforcement is going to be, because, like we've run across with other things, Albany doesn't have the resources to enforce these things. And so you have to start with incentives, then you go to enforcement. Just a higher level thought.
I want to second what Eric just said, because that's almost exactly what I wrote down too. It's like, it is both. It's both of those things. And then the question is, in what order? So maybe the order is fleshing out the ordinance enough that you can communicate what you think it will be, and tell folks that there is something local on the horizon, but begin with incentives. Give people ample time and all that.
It sounds like there's really good models out there, Marin and San Mateo, so it'd be interesting. I don't know if we're going to plan a follow-up on this. Once you've gotten some some pilot information and some information from the other cities about how they did this, how they rolled it out, that'd be interesting. I think information for us, or we could go off and do our own research, but that would be interesting.
Yeah, I also forgot to mention, I may have mentioned it during my first presentation, Stop Waste has a pretty extensive model ordinance that basically lists all of the possible requirements, incentives, and you can kind of pick and choose and work through that. So that's something that we've been using to come up with some of these ideas, but that's something we're definitely going to be utilizing when we get down to writing it.
More comments I'll add for now. I guess one, I wouldn't fully discount the impact of even a small fee. I was just pulling up some research on fees that have been put on plastic bags or paper bags and things of like 5 to 7 cents. I've seen one study in Chicago where it reduced, it was saying usage by nearly, where was it? some pretty high percent. They're saying went from 80% of consumers down to fewer to 10% after putting a 7-cent bag fee. So I think there could be some benefits potentially there, even with a smaller fee. And then the second one I wanted to say was just, I fully supported the comments by Ian. I think temporary events could be potentially a really impactful one, especially by design. They're usually just bringing goods or services that are just for that short amount of time. So it seems like a really easy way to, provide, be able to have foodware that meets like that short need.
I'm also thinking when you brought that up, like in terms of especially here, as I shop, when they ask me like, oh, do you want the 15-cent extra charge for the bag? I wonder like also just making it more common that, I go to school in Berkeley, so I'm referencing we already have the fee in Berkeley, but like if they directly told you about this fee that you're about to pay, like the 25-cent, because whenever I go like shopping at the grocery store, then I'm verbally hearing that I'm paying extra. But when I go to like a coffee shop in Berkeley and I spend those 25 cents, they never mention anything about it. I just see it, if I go through my bank statement and I see like, 25% cup fee, but they never actually upfront ask me about it. So I also think that could discourage people that they don't know they have an option to bring their own cup. Because if you're never mentioned, are you okay with a 25% disposable cup charge, or do you have your own? Then that would provide a consumer, especially those who regularly visit coffee shops, as many people kind of have their staple, they go there every week, every day even. I see the same people at the same places. But like if they made that kind of option available and communicated that better, more people might feel like, oh gosh, I realize I'm spending this and it's adding up over time, similar to how they did at like Trader Joe's when they ask you, like, are you okay with the extra fee?
If you guys don't mind, I'd just like to direct your attention to two questions that I'm really curious about your thoughts on, kind of going off of what Member Fasoon was saying. The first one is, are cups the right container to focus on? We were talking about bags, and those are pretty easily replaceable with reusables. Cups, in some cases, might be more difficult, especially if we're thinking about cold drink cups, like a soda fountain cup. That's maybe a bit more challenging. Maybe we want to be looking at containers more widely. There are some cities that have been looking at sort of containers in general, not just cups. And I think from an equity perspective, and even just a general perspective, it's important to make sure that if we're trying to incentivize someone to bring a reusable, that's a real option for them in that scenario. Not just, here's your fee for not bringing your reusable cup for your soda that you're not actually able to use because, it doesn't match the sizes that this business has, or they're pre-filled cups that they're selling you or something like that. So those are some of the things that we've been thinking about a bit, and like how to design this in a way that really is an effective incentive. So I'm curious if you guys have sort of any thoughts on that, if sticking with cups seems to make sense to you, if broadening it or redesigning, if you have any sort of ideas or kind of initial thoughts on that.
I feel like we're always, because there is a small staff and a limited budget, we're always we always want to know exactly what the priorities are. And I maybe made this comment earlier, but to me, I would feel that the most change, the fastest, would be to focus holistically on takeout stuff from the restaurant perspective, because then you're not looking at one consumer decision at a time. It's the whole restaurant. Sometimes that includes cups, and sometimes it's other stuff.
It's okay if no one else has thoughts. I'm not sure either, but. The other thing I was interested in was the idea of a discount, either rather than or in addition to a charge, like a discount if you bring a reusable. So if you have a thought on that idea as well, I'd be interested to hear about it. Or anything else you want to share.
How is that funded?
I don't know.
All right.
But There's some different possibilities. I think if the committee is interested in it, that's something we could look into more. If the committee's not really interested in that approach, we might leave it, so.
One more comment on making the most change the fastest, which is that on your other slide, you asked, I guess, to what extent should the city be funding some of these incentives? And I love that you've been able to already get going with small increments that just come right out of community development. I would love to see as much of that as you can manage to get done. You know, that's really great because oh my goodness, getting something formally funded, that is not the most change the fastest. So it sounds like you're already kind of on the right track there.
We are at 9:12 now, so we can speed really quickly through, or we can extend again and talk for a few more minutes.
I don't have much other than, you know, great questions, and it's, I'd love to be able to give more feedback, but I just don't, you know, I don't know.
Do you have any more discussion? We'll go to the next item. Okay, last item. Future agenda items. I think I know how this works, but I'm not sure. We're going to go to public first.
Yeah, we can skip past public comments since we only have 2 minutes on the clock, or we can open for like 30 seconds.
Let's do short public comments.
Okay.
All right, we'll move over to public comment.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll try to keep it quick. I think it'd be good to get an update on the city facilities electrification plan. I think there should be an emphasis on converting the community center as soon as possible, including potential upgrades as a resilience center with assistance from Ava Community Energy. I think, you know, waiting for a whole big full plan coming out, maybe just focus on a facility by facility and start with the community center. So I'd love to see the Climate Action Committee discuss that.
Thank you very much. That is all for public comment.
How about any agenda items from the committee?
I was curious to learn more about the parking enforcement vehicle situation. I don't know if that should be a future agenda item or if there's just a way for you to send more information to us, but what I heard from public comment was disappointing, and so I'd like to learn if it's too late for us to do anything or what the status is.
Any other agenda items for next month?
I was interested in discussing more the idea of a tree ordinance brought up by public commenter earlier. I think this is something I would personally have bandwidth to research and champion this month, but interested if anyone else is research that topic.
Anyone else? Okay, that was a good meeting. Thanks, everyone. This adjourns our meeting. Can you say what time it is?
Perfect, right on time.
All right. Hooray. Good job. Yay, everybody.